All right, let's dive in. This time, we're taking a closer look at Ed and Lorraine Warren.
Oh, Warrens.
Those paranormal investigators everyone's heard of?
Yeah, their names are practically synonymous with ghost hunting, aren't they?
Exactly. We've got a ton of material to go through: biographies, their famous cases, even some skeptical viewpoints.
Gotta keep things balanced.
Right. So the big question is, were they really communicating with spirits, or were they just really good at telling spooky stories?
Well, one thing that always struck me about the Warrens is the sheer volume of cases they claim to have worked on.
Oh, yeah. Like, how many are we talking?
They said over 10,000.
10,000.
Over their entire careers. They started the New England Society for Psychic Research back in '52.
Wow, that's a lot of potential ghost encounters. But it wasn't just them on these investigations, right? They had a whole team.
Yeah, they always emphasized that doctors, police officers, even clergy.
Trying to make it seem more credible, I guess.
Right, like it was a legit multidisciplinary approach to the paranormal.
Not just a couple of ghost hunters running around with EMF readers.
Exactly.
Right.
But there's a catch. We don't often hear much about what those other experts actually found.
Interesting.
The spotlight's always on Ed and Lorraine.
So maybe their methods weren't as scientific as they made it seem.
Could be.
But hey, let's be real. We love a good ghost story.
Of course.
And the Warrens definitely gave us those. I mean, look at the Conjuring Universe. Those movies wouldn't exist without their cases.
True. Those films definitely cemented their place in pop culture.
No doubt. So, should we jump into some of those famous cases?
Let's. How about we start with a classic? Annabelle, the possessed doll.
Oh, Annabelle. That story is terrifying.
Two roommates convinced the Raggedy Ann doll was possessed by a little girl's spirit.
And not a friendly one?
Nope, they said it wanted to cause harm.
Classic horror movie setup. And of course, the Warrens arrived to save the day.
They claimed it wasn't a little girl at all, but a demonic presence using the doll.
And then they locked it away in their occult museum.
Safe from the world, or at least that's the story.
You know, speaking of that museum, it's like something straight out of a horror movie. All those supposedly cursed objects collected from their investigations, it makes you wonder if those things really held the power they claimed, or if it was all just for show.
That's the question that hangs over all their work, isn't it? Were they truly dealing with the supernatural, or were they masters of presentation?
Tough to say. All right, well, we've got Annabelle, but we can't forget about the Perron family haunting.
Another one that became a huge movie.
The Conjuring, right. The Rhode Island farmhouse with the witch, Bathsheba Sherman.
Classic haunted house story. All the elements are there. A malevolent spirit, terrified family, and of course the Warrens swooping in to confront the evil.
It's a formula that works, even if some details might have been, let's say, exaggerated.
Maybe a little.
A bit more dramatic, right?
But not all their cases are as clear-cut. Take the Amityville Horror, for example. That one's been debated for decades.
Oh, Amityville. That's a whole other can of worms. Definitely one of the most controversial hauntings ever.
And the Warrens were right in the thick of it.
But there's a whole other side to that story that suggests it might have been, well...
a hoax.
Yeah. We've got skeptics like the Kaplans who called it out.
And then there's the lawyer involved,
who admitted they made the whole thing up over some wine.
Oops.
Not exactly a ringing endorsement of the Warrens' credibility, is it?
It definitely shows that even with their involvement, things weren't always as they seemed. Lorraine insisted it was real, but there's some strong evidence pointing the other way.
So maybe Amityville was a bit of a bust, but there must be other cases with stronger evidence, right? Something to back up their claims of genuine supernatural encounters.
Well, the Enfield poltergeist is another one that's been heavily scrutinized. It was a big inspiration for The Conjuring 2, and the Warrens were convinced it was a case of demonic possession.
But even with that one, there are claims they weren't even the main investigators.
Right. They weren't invited at first. Guy Lyon Playfair, a parapsychologist who actually worked the case, said Ed Warren was boasting about how much money they could make from it.
That's a bit different from the selfless paranormal crusaders they presented themselves as.
Definitely adds another layer to the story.
It seems like the line between genuine investigation and self-promotion might have been a little blurry with them.
That's a recurring theme we see throughout their work. And it leads us to another captivating case, Arne Johnson, the demon murder trial.
Oh yeah, the one where the guy claimed demonic possession as a defense for murder.
Exactly. And guess what? The Warrens were involved in that one too.
Of course they were. Weren't they called in before the murder to deal with a supposed possession in the family?
You got it. So they were essentially trying to argue that demonic influence was a legitimate factor in a court of law.
Wow, talk about pushing boundaries. I can only imagine the media circus surrounding that trial.
Oh, it was huge. And surprise, surprise, it inspired another Conjuring movie.
It's like they had a knack for finding cases that would grab the public's attention, whether because they were genuinely spooky or just ripe for a dramatic adaptation.
It makes you wonder if that was by design or just a coincidence.
Were they drawn to these sensational cases, or did they recognize their potential for fame and fortune?
Hard to say for sure.
It's like trying to put together a puzzle with some pieces missing.
We have these captivating stories, but also these nagging doubts.
How do we make sense of it all?
Well, maybe by shifting our focus from the individual cases to their overall approach, or their methods. What kind of evidence do they actually present, and how do they justify their conclusions?
Okay, so let's get into the nitty-gritty.
Let's talk methods, evidence, and those critiques they face from the scientific community.
Because you know what they say. The devil's in the details.
Oh, absolutely. And in the Warrens' case, those details might reveal more than just a few spooky stories.
All right, let's do it. Let's talk about their investigative approach. They always said they used a diverse team of experts, which sounds impressive on the surface.
It does. But did they really embrace a multidisciplinary approach? Or was it all just for show?
Let's find out.
So this diverse team they always talked about, having doctors, clergy, police officers, you'd think that'd mean they were taking a more scientific approach.
Right, like they were trying to get to the bottom of things.
Exactly. But did they ever actually publish any findings? Like, did they go through peer review the way real scientific studies do?
That's a good point. That's kind of what separates a structured investigation from, well, just telling ghost stories.
Yeah, and this is where things get a little fuzzy with the Warrens. They wrote books, sure, but those aren't held to the same standards as academic research.
So no controlled experiments or anything like that. It sounds like they relied more on personal experiences, like I felt cold or the doll moved.
Exactly. And that kind of evidence, while it might be spooky, isn't really what you'd call hard proof.
It's more about individual perception than scientific fact.
You got it.
Yeah.
And that's where people like Perry DeAngelis and Stephen Novella come in. They were pretty vocal critics of the Warrens, even calling their evidence blarney.
Blarney? What's that, like a fancy word for BS?
Pretty much. They were basically saying that the Warrens relied too much on subjective things, like Lorraine's supposed psychic abilities, instead of actual data.
Which, to a scientist, wouldn't be very convincing.
Not at all. And this skepticism also applied to their methods for, as they called it, demon detection.
Oh, right. They used dowsing rods, Ouija boards, even claimed they recorded demonic voices.
EVPs, yeah.
Are those EVPs considered reliable evidence in the paranormal world? I see those on all those ghost hunting shows.
EVPs are a great example of how easily things can be misinterpreted. You get a recording with faint whispers or distorted sounds, and the Warrens would say, that's a demon talking. But skeptics would point to more mundane explanations, like radio interference or just background noise.
So it all comes down to interpretation. But were the Warrens' recordings ever independently verified, like by someone outside their team?
Not really. And that's a common theme in a lot of their work, a lack of outside verification and independent analysis. That's why guys like Joe Nickell and Benjamin Radford, who are well-known skeptical investigators, dismissed a lot of the Warrens' big cases.
Including Amityville, right?
Yeah, they said a lot of it was fabricated.
It almost seems like their investigations were more about theatrics and storytelling than rigorous research.
There's definitely an argument to be made for that.
Yeah.
Look at the objects in their occult museum, the Annabelle doll, satanic idols, even a child's tombstone.
It's all very visually striking, definitely plays into people's fears and fascination with the macabre.
Exactly. It's a carefully crafted presentation, and it was a huge part of their appeal. And you know what? You see this same kind of approach in a lot of paranormal reality shows today.
So in a way, the Warrens were pioneers of this type of entertainment.
They may not have been scientists, but they were masters of showmanship. But does that mean they didn't believe in what they were doing? That's a tough one to answer.
It's like a blurry line between genuine belief and, well, being good at self-promotion.
Maybe they truly believed in their mission, but also knew how to tell a good story and captivate an audience.
So where does that leave us? Their work sparked a lot of interest in the paranormal, but their lack of scientific rigor kind of casts a shadow over everything.
It's a complicated legacy, for sure. And it raises an interesting question. How should we approach their work? Should we take it at face value or view it with a healthy dose of skepticism?
That's something I struggle with, especially with all the paranormal content out there these days. It's easy to get sucked into a good ghost story, but we have to remember that extraordinary claims need extraordinary evidence.
Absolutely. And with the Warrens, that evidence is often missing. But that doesn't automatically mean everything they investigated was fake. It just means we need to be critical thinkers.
Right. Just because something can't be scientifically proven doesn't mean it didn't happen.
Exactly. But it also doesn't mean it did.
It's like walking a tightrope between belief and skepticism.
We have to use our judgment and decide for ourselves what we believe. That's what makes exploring these topics so fascinating. We don't always get clear-cut answers.
Totally. This deep dive has definitely given me a lot to think about. But we've talked a lot about their methods and the skepticism, but we haven't really touched on their overall impact.
You're right. They're practically synonymous with paranormal investigation, whether people like them or not.
They definitely shaped how we view the supernatural.
Oh, absolutely. They popularized this image of the paranormal investigator as a sort of like spiritual warrior, battling demons and evil spirits.
Like Ed Warren with his crucifix and holy water, right?
Yeah.
Very dramatic, almost Hollywood-esque.
Exactly. And that imagery has influenced countless books, movies, TV shows. They basically created a blueprint for how we portray paranormal investigations.
It's like they gave us a visual language for the supernatural.
And that's had both positive and negative effects. On one hand, it sparked interest in the paranormal, encouraging people to be more open-minded.
But it also contributed to a lot of misinformation and sensationalism.
You're right. So many paranormal shows today are all about entertainment, not accuracy. And they often use a distorted version of the Warrens' methods to create drama, but it's often misleading.
So their legacy is kind of a double-edged sword.
Exactly. They brought the paranormal to mainstream culture, but they also played a role in its exploitation. That's why it's so important to be careful about what we believe, especially with all the information out there.
We can't just take everything at face value, especially when it comes to the paranormal. We got to question things, do our research, and make up our own minds.
Well said. So where do we go from here? We've talked about their investigations, their methods, their impact. What's the main takeaway from all this?
I think the biggest thing is that the Warrens' story is kind of a cautionary tale.
Oh.
It reminds us that, especially when dealing with the unknown, we need critical thinking, skepticism, and a real dedication to finding the truth, even if it's hard to find.
Because even the most exciting stories can be misleading.
Exactly. It's up to each of us to decide what we believe, but we should do it with open minds and critical thinking.
Well said. This has been quite the deep dive. We've learned a lot, but it feels like we have even more questions now.
That's what makes this whole topic so intriguing. The more you learn, the more you realize you don't know.
True. But before we wrap things up, I want to go back to something that really stood out to me. The Warrens, claiming to have worked on over 10,000 cases.
Yeah, that's a crazy number.
It makes you think about all the stories, all the experiences out there that we might never fully understand.
And it shows just how much we still don't know about the paranormal.
We focus on the Warrens and their big cases. But there are so many other people and groups out there investigating these phenomena, each with their own methods and beliefs.
So what we've talked about today is just a tiny glimpse into a huge, mysterious world.
Exactly. As we finish up our exploration of Ed and Lorraine Warren, it's important to remember that the search for truth is ongoing.
There are still so many questions, so many mysteries to unravel.
And that's what makes it so exciting. So keep exploring, keep questioning, and stay curious.
Because the world of the paranormal is full of wonders, both real and imagined.
And it's our job to figure out the difference.
It's amazing how the Warrens, really tapped into that, like, our need for the unknown, you know? Like, as humans, we're always looking for patterns, trying to make sense of things.
We are. It's like we're hardwired for that what if, you know?
Yeah.
Always looking for answers, and sometimes those answers lead us to the supernatural.
And that's where it gets really interesting, right? Because believing in the paranormal, it's not just about ghosts and demons. It kind of reflects deeper stuff, cultural anxieties, our desire for meaning, especially when the world feels chaotic.
Absolutely. When people buy into the Warren stories, it might be about more than just a good scare, you know? They might be searching for answers to those bigger questions about life and death, the whole shebang.
Like trying to cope with the stuff we don't understand, find some comfort in the face of our fears.
Right. And the Warrens, with all their talk of good versus evil spiritual battles, they gave people a way to make sense of those anxieties. They offered hope This belief that even in the darkest places, there are forces fighting for good.
It's like a modern mythology, a way to deal with the unknown, find a bit of peace in the uncertainty.
Exactly. And that's a big reason why, even with all the skepticism, their legacy is still so strong. They didn't just give us ghost stories. They gave us a way to think about those big fundamental questions that we all face.
So this deep dive, it hasn't just been about separating fact from fiction. It's been about exploring the whole idea of belief, the power of stories, and why we're so drawn to the paranormal.
Well said. So as we wrap up, where do we stand on the big question? Were they legit investigators or just really good storytellers?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? We've looked at the evidence or the lack of it, their methods, their impact. But ultimately, the truth, just like the paranormal itself, remains a bit of a mystery.
And maybe that's okay. Maybe the real point is the exploration, the questioning, the searching, even if we don't get definitive answers.
Exactly. What matters is that we approach this stuff critically, with open minds and a healthy dose of skepticism. Don't just accept things blindly, dig a little deeper, do your research, and come to your own conclusions.
Couldn't have said it better myself. So, to our listeners out there, keep exploring, keep questioning, and never lose that sense of wonder. There's a lot out there we don't understand, and the journey is just as important as the destination.
That's a great way to put it. And who knows, maybe someday we'll finally get to the bottom of the whole Ed and Lorraine Warren mystery.
Until then, the mystery lives on. And that's part of the fun, right?
Absolutely. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the world of the Warrens.
It is a pleasure.
And to our listeners, thanks for listening. Keep those thinking caps on, and we'll catch you on our next deep dive.